Well, hello everyone. Once again, we're live and recording. I know that because it says so right there in front of me on the screen. I'm Dave Williams, your host of the weekly Find Your Normal show. And as those of you that are following us know, for the last couple of years, we've been here trying to answer questions about dealing with a number of issues. And in this season, we've been focusing in on how does one handle being at the crossroads of a crisis and try to find some element of peace and more importantly, learn how to just live in the moment and deal with the stress of life that you're facing, regardless of whether it's, a disease or a debt or a disaster or maybe a political election. There's many things that, have create stress and crisis in people's mind. I'm here because as those of you, again, that are fans of the show know, I was a cancer patient and struggled a lot with the issues of the treatment program and faced life and death a few times and raised my hands in the air. Please help me. This is not a good, enjoyable situation that I'm in. And one of the nice things that happened to me along my journey is I met my co-host, Sheila Schuster, or I guess it's Sheila Schultz now, is here on the screen. And depending on whether you're watching us live or the replay, she could be positioned almost anywhere. But Sheila has been a most helpful person in helping me deal with these elements. And I'd like to once again say hi, Sheila. Thanks for coming in. I'm glad you're with us today.
Hi, Dave. I'm glad to be here. I am Sheila Schultz. I have a business called A Quiet Mind, and I help people move through major transitions in life, adapt to changes, recover from loss. And my primary focus is being mindful and living in the moment. A lot of our topics go into spirituality and as well as physical and emotional well-being. And I'm so excited this week to have Curtis with us and learn so much more. I know a tip of the iceberg about this topic. So very excited to hear how the next hour goes.
It is an exciting topic. I really welcome having Curtis Giles with us today. I stumbled across him in my search for how do I find peace a number of months ago, maybe at the turn of the year, and found a unbelievable Monday night show talking about a philosopher and theologian and mystic of the 17th century called Emanuel Swedenborg. And you wouldn't think that someone 300 years ago had much to say about dealing with the issues we've been talking about. But the odd thing about Swedenborg is he took 20 years and visited the afterlife. Now, that sounds a little crazy to some of you out there, although we've tried to set the stage for today's show in the past. We've talked about angels. We've talked about near-death experiences. But every Monday night, Curtis comes on as the host of his show, Off the Left Eye, looking at life through the eyes of Swedenborg, who was this 17th century Renaissance kind of person who went for a good 20 years of his life in spending time in the spiritual world and literally wrote everything down, 27 volumes of detailed information. You'd be amazed at the complexity of the writings that this gentleman had. And I welcome you, Curtis, because you're so good at sharing what appears to the outsiders being very complex topics, and you make things so simple. And maybe that's what you could do, is make Swedenborg a little simple to us of who he was and why you decided he's someone you should talk about every week.
Sure. Happy to try my best at it. I think you said it sounds strange, the idea of experience with an alternate reality or whatever you want to call what he was doing. And if you had talked to him at 48, he would have said the same thing. Like, who are you talking about? Somebody's going to go visit the other world. But he had this change of life direction. And I'm here talking about it today because, as you said, complex things and simple things. he starts talking about this broad picture of reality with all kinds of out there stuff. But when you get down to what he's saying about the nuts and bolts of life and the kinds of things that would apply to moving through crises like you're talking about, it actually ends up very practical and very intuitive, that you can go from kind of like, I think about it like, you know, the Large Hadron Collider. There's this giant thing that they set up in Europe where they got to take particles and zoom them around under these amazing conditions, get them to collide. And then from that, you study what life is made of. But you have to go to these extremes to figure out what's up with the normal stuff we deal with every day. And I think that's kind of like the story of Swedenborg, is he went to the extremes, saw all this stuff, and from it pulled out this very, very holistic way to look at life.
But he wasn't just sitting there at his desk and thinking about things and writing, right? I mean, he literally went someplace and lived there over a 20-year period of time.
That's right. I mean, his day to day was absolutely not normal, and he wasn't. You hear about people who have had like a near death experience, which is something happens, some kind of physical trauma, where an event is triggered where you're suddenly somewhere else, and you have this amazing. Often people have this amazing encounter with some kind of higher intelligence. They'll see the purpose of their life, all this stuff, and then they come back and they write a book about it and think about it and gain insight from it. With Swedenborg, his never stopped. He had 3 decades of reported uninterrupted exposure to this other side, but was able to be so lucid there that he could be pondering specific topics and go and inquire and learn about what's the truth behind this. And he would see, it's almost like he had a backstage pass to that world. It's not just coming back telling you about phenomena, but the underlying causes of those. And we're talking about another world, but Swedenborg says that the part of you that thinks and feels is a spirit. So we're dual citizens right now of both of those worlds. So when we're talking about all this out there stuff, we're talking about really what's going on in our own hearts and minds. So it does come back to being very practical and very much something we already are all dealing with. We just didn't know the underlying factors that went into these experiences that we're having every day. So he was having these amazing, fantastical things happen to him, but it's just a spectrum from where we all are. His just became overt and obvious.
I mean, when you look at the religious texts and you have prophets and spiritual leaders, people like a Jesus Christ entering the earth, where they take on a human form and communicate to the godly world of some sort. This is not what you're talking about. This was not a farmer or a peasant sitting there talking and getting inspiration from a god. This was a scientist, a philosopher, a theologian, a person very much like you might say a Da Vinci, with many different capabilities.
Yeah, if he hadn't had this spiritual experience, this set of spiritual experiences that we're talking about now, I don't think you would have had to introduce him on the program. I think everybody would know who Swedenborg is because of the contributions he was making to science, the trajectory he was on. He was in the age of brilliant minds. He was one of the top minds. The newspapers would say Swedenborg is in Amsterdam today because he was so famous for his discoveries, and not just in one field, in every field that he was studying and publishing and leading in fields as diverse as anatomy and mining and the beginning rudiments of psychology, talking about the way that the world worked and all these different facets. And he was doing very well at it. But as you can imagine, once you start to talk about spirits and God and life after death, the scientific community doesn't think that's that very cool. And so, he fell off. And I think but his mind was an important part of the whole thing. It wasn't just like this was some automatic transmission. He looked back on his prior life. He didn't have any sense that this was coming. He was thinking, okay, he was in the middle of, I think, studying the brain and anatomy. That was really what his passion was then. He was looking for, how does consciousness work? Where, if there's a soul, where is it located in the body? He was going after that, but he wasn't thinking, okay, then I'm going to start to be able to talk to spirits and angels and that kind of. He thought he would continue on his trajectory, but when he looked back, he saw that all the work that I did, everything that I learned, all the information I filled with my mind with, the processes I developed, that was all preparing me for this. That I couldn't have just received no education and had this happen, because the things that you learn are almost containers that these higher concepts can come into. And because the two worlds are so intimately linked, the more you know about the physical world, the more you're primed to learn and understand things about the spiritual world. So for him, it was, you couldn't separate his training in his life from the quality of his experiences later. Not that you have to have a certain number of PhDs to see the afterlife, but it was part of how he was prepared to learn not just what it's like, but learn the underlying features, because he'd already had this mind that was developed. And that's a big part of his ideology also, is you sometimes think of, here's the physical world, and it's very specific the way that it works. Before this program started, I was having trouble connecting to this live stream, right? And that's because there's technology and software that has to be exactly right, and you have to have clicked just right. The physical world is so tangible and is so law-driven, but people just sort of think of the spiritual as like, oh, stuff just happens, but he's saying spiritual reality is just as complex, actually more so, and just as ordered. So so for him to be able to get this kind of information sent to him, he had to have the right, he had to have the right foundation on his end. So that was his scientific journey that led him to that point.
Curtis, I have a question for you. For a lot of us, we had to there was an event in our life that at a certain point thrust us into the spiritual world, thrust us into this question and answer period. Was that the same for him? Was there a turning point? Did something happen that was a specific instance?
I think there's people who actually know more about this than I do, but I'm happy to tell you what I know. And what I understand about him was, some people's life will turn very quickly, like a hairpin turn. Like I think about people, I was just quoting in another show, this woman who had an IED. She was a contractor and had an IED explode under her vehicle, and then 5 seconds and her experience happened. Swedenborg was more like a big barge turning a little slower than that he had precursors to this. They had little things that could almost be called spiritual experiences coming up. But really, when he started to make that turn, you can actually read about it, because he kept a journal of his dreams during that period.
Right.
And he not only would he keep a journal of his dreams, but he would then go and psychoanalyze his own dreams, which back then there was no such thing as psychoanalysis. But he would talk about, there was a dog that kept appearing in his dreams. And he said, I think this is a symbol of my pride. That because he was so successful, he was really struggling with feeling like, what, I'm really cool. And as this spiritual turn, there's no like spiritual growth without personal growth. So as he was opening up like this, he had to deal with things like his pride, his other negative aspects. And there's initial huge struggle where he really got humbled and got his worldview shaken to the point where he was ready to accept something new. And he does write about his dreams getting more and more intense. And then you hear about some overt, what you'd call spiritual experiences that he started to have. And eventually, and I was just talking with Dr. Jonathan Rose, who's on our program sometimes, who's translating Swedenborg's works. And he was doing a lot of studying into, there was sort of these different phases. It didn't happen all at once. There was sort of phases of him getting more and more deeply in. But once he hit this one point, then it was like, he's in and he's there to stay, pretty much. There was a little bit of backtracking, but somehow he had broken the code, and now he's in there. But it was like I was just saying, it was a process. It seemed to take longer than your average near-death experience, but then again, it lasted longer. So maybe it was a different kind of preparation he needed because there was a different purpose.
Mm-hmm. I see. And I also liked what you were talking about, the sort of reflection of structured life here and a structured spiritual life, and in the spiritual realm, because for me it's sort of a dance, because you kind of you back off from what your head is thinking and the structure here, and as soon as you do that, you see the structure in spirituality. And where I see it is in nature. When you look at a flower, it's all math, right? And trees and everything just makes so much more. It's very scientific. I have a scientific background. So, but yet there's this sort of softness to it too. So it's a really interesting mix for me as I see it.
Yeah. I mean, I think Swedenborg would call it love and wisdom. This sort of like the sharp and the soft coexisting.
Yes. That's perfect.
Yeah. Well, he wrote that there are two fundamental elements to everything. And that one of the two ways you can label them, or one of the ways you can label them, is love and wisdom. He also calls them goodness and truth, or essence and form. And it is this kind of both. And I get, you see this reflected everywhere, right brain, left brain, even though it's a little more complex than that. But there is this sort of this duality he says goes all the way back to the very origins of everything. And nature in particular, he's saying that nature is a physical reflection of spiritual reality. So you when you see that flower, you are seeing some spiritual eternal truth manifested in a form. And we talked about how joined the two worlds are. That this world is like an echo, like an audio echo of a sound of the spiritual world. So we're like we're part of the same chain of events. It's not like the spiritual world is way out there and we're here. The two are always interacting, and we can. I think when we get a feeling like the one you're talking about, that's when we're starting to. Some of that's coming through, and we're understanding like this is gorgeous. Like something is here, but it's not just feeling and it's not just thought. It's this marriage of both of them.
Exactly.
When you say the word world, I mean, you are talking about a tangible visual world that he's visiting. I mean, it wasn't like an experiencer having a near-death event, seeing the light, seeing a spiritual being, having some kind of emotional feeling. Swedenborg actually visited a physical entity that had mountains and streams and animals and trees, and had conversations with people, had coffee, sat around and chatted and discussed and debated. This was a tangible entity that he actually mapped out like a cartographer would and said, this is the layout of what the spiritual world looks like.
Yeah. And even beyond that, there were cities, there were houses, there were things that sound a lot like skyscrapers. It was very tangible and more real than this world. And actually that this world is kind of a reflection of that one. Like I was just saying, he even said, I'll just weird out your audience, but he was saying that, that he visited London on that side, that there is it's not the exact same place, but there's a corresponding place there, and he was asking people, do you have this same kind of drink that we have down here? It's like to that tangible. It was this like all the details are there, but yet there are, and there's a lot of similarity, but then there are also these fundamental differences in the way that it works that he mapped out as well. But first impression would be, oh, this is a lot like what I'm used to, in the very beginning. And he said that's, if it wasn't like that, this life would sort of be throwaway. We're spending this whole life learning how to navigate a reality, learning how to be a person, how to interact with other people, how to move around objects. You don't lose all that. It sort of evolves into something greater on that side, but the basic structure of how it is appears similar, although there's a lot of differences between the spiritual and the physical, but they can communicate in that way.
Curtis, does he take the leap, or is there some sense that you were already there and then you come into a form and then you go back there? I mean, is that place eternal?
Form? He seems to indicate that we're moving up in stages, like, before we got to this world, we're in the womb, right? You're in the womb and you're developing into a very different set of conditions. And then you're born out into this world. And he sort of says that this world is like a womb to the next life, that it's all the conditions are set up here so that we can develop not our bodies, but our minds and our spirits, and develop specifically through, you have this matrix here, this interacting with people where you get to do things like be nice to people when the opportunity arises. You get to take advantage of people if you want when the opportunity arises. You get to, in real time, choose what am I going to act on and what am I not going to act on? And what am I going to pursue and what am I going to love? And all those activities shape the spirit. And that here we have the ability to shape our spirit and form our mind. And that then once we shed the body, we're in that world. And he doesn't talk about, he says that life is eternal, and you stay there, but you're not static, like you're always growing. He says that every stage you're in is almost like an egg to the next stage, that people can be perfected or grow wiser and more loving forever. He doesn't talk about you returning here to do it again, but he talks about a continued chain of a continued chain of excitement and meaning. It's not like everything's changing and cool, and then you have the same life forever. That there's this, it gets more and more potent the deeper you get in.
Really interesting. Gosh, there's just so many questions, Dave.
I know when you start to listen to Curtis, and every week you just get overwhelmed by all. I mean, it's going to be a lifetime. Curtis will never run out of information to talk about because it raises the questions. And when, as I said, as a cancer patient in great stress, calling out, is there a God? Is there someone on my side? Is there an angel that's going to look after me? Am I being punished for what I did? I mean, these sort of human questions that we ask, Swedenborg also tried to understand them because he was living in a time of Christianity, and the Bible was something that he was trying to map what he was seeing against Christian principles. And, he wasn't, being an agnostic or an atheist. He was sensing that there was some creator force that existed that was creating it, and it got involved with in our life. And when we talk to the other world, there is a communication path. What was Swedenborg trying to tell us in that kind of message?
Yeah. So the take home is that love matters, and doing good things now, and basically taking what's loving and acting on it, and to the best of our ability, not acting on what we know is harmful. That's essential. And he did definitely talk about God. He talked about, when I say love and wisdom, we were talking about that earlier. That's what God is. That God has two essential elements that are unified: love and wisdom. And we're talking about infinite love and infinite wisdom. And everything, when I say a flower is a reflection of those things, it's really this little piece. We're seeing like one little facet of the divine there. And that not only flow, but everything, people are a little facet of the design, of the divine. I mean, that we are, in learning to love people, we're learning to love God. And because we are part of this same system. But he certainly talks about a lot of things that would feel comfortable to traditional Christians. He talks about angels. But he says that angels are just us as we evolve and get better and better, which is not what all denominations are saying. But he says he would meet angels who were everything that you hear about in a near-death experience. This light and love. And he just says, you'd be stunned if you could see how much love is radiating out of them. But he's saying that this is someone who's been brought along a journey, and this is like where you get. This is the kind of result there. He talks about God, and he talks about God being intimately present in everything. I talk about, we're shaping what our spirit is, but we're shaping it together. Every person and God, there's a little connection in the heart and mind, and that there's just, that's where the work is being done, even though it's not apparent. We have this feeling that we're alone. It feels like, hey, I'm just living. Maybe there's God, maybe there's not. And that intellectual freedom is essential. We have to, if God imposed on us and just said, look, I'm here, then we wouldn't be human. We wouldn't be able to choose who we want, like choose who we are. Because, you already know the answers. So that's maintained intentionally. But there's an unceasing effort. He called it divine providence, to pull us towards what is happier and happier, and pull the entire human race towards what is happier and happier as far as we're willing to take it.
I love what you said, Curtis, about shedding the skin. That's how I think of it with death. A lot of people say your soul leaves your body. I never thought of it that way. I just feel like your skin falls off. You shed your form, and that's really resonates. I think you're the first person I've ever heard of who says that, and I say it too. So that's pretty cool.
Okay, we can split the revenue from that if we trade.
Good. Sure, I'm going to work on that later. The other thing I was questioning or curious about is, did he see parallels with his work and other prophets, or outside of Christianity? Was there sort of a, no, this is the way it is, or saying, yeah, they're saying the same thing in a different way?
The latter. They're saying the same thing in a different way. And he was, so nowadays it's cool to say all faiths could be a path to heaven, right?
Right.
Back in his day, that wasn't cool to say, but he's saying it anyway.
I bet you it wasn't.
His writings were put on trial, and he was making the claim that what actually matters is that you're living rightly by what you believe is true. that's what really puts you on the right spiritual path. He said there's a potential in any religious system, as long as it's not like, as long as you're following the basics of the golden rule, like there's certain systems you could come up with that are not a good system just because they're based on killing people or something like that. Right. But as long as you're within the general category, anything can be a path to heaven, provided you're living by what you truly believe is right and you're trying to connect to a higher power. So he would talk about people from all different kinds of religions in the afterlife and what they were like, and he even said that a lot of the greatest trouble was coming out of his own Christian tradition. He was sort of a reformer in that way, saying that people are getting a lot of things wrong. People are replacing where there should be love, they have ideas and exclusionism and that kind of thing. So he was a lot of ink spent trying to wake people up in his own tradition. But he talks, he has this interesting sense of universal relevance of the different traditions. He talks about an initial period where there was no written revelation or anything like that. It was all just people saw nature. And the kind of thing you're talking about with the flower there, that was their church and that was their Bible. And this was how the original state of humanity was. And he said that vestiges of that continue in other religious traditions. He said Egyptian hieroglyphics were based on that this language of symbolism. And he doesn't talk about it, but I would assume that extends to various kinds of cave paintings you see around and that kind of thing. So he says that there was that. He talks about multiple different revelations that happened and spread in different ways in the world. There is a particular trajectory he follows with the Abrahamic faith, because he's talking about a particular role they play overall in the grand spiritual picture, but he doesn't. So he spends a lot of time focusing and giving information on this is what this means, this is what this means, this is what this means. But no, he completely says that you can find all kinds of spiritual success in whatever path, because just like the argument that everyone makes, where you're brought up in the world vastly influences what your belief system is going to be. And it wouldn't make sense if it was anything else. But yeah, Swedenborg was, back before it was cool, he was saying that it's not religious institution that matters. It's not professed belief system that matters. It's what's in the heart. And we all have a basic sense of like, oh yeah, be good, don't be bad. Try to love when the opportunity comes up. And it's really about intent. It's not even really about actions.
Right.
Because he says that there's 1,000 that 1,000 people could do the same action in the world, whatever it is. Spiritually, if you looked at them, it could mean 1,000 different things, because you don't know what their motives were. You don't know what the forces acting on them were, like what history is acting on them, or their upbringing or whatever. And he also says we really shouldn't make what he calls spiritual judgments. We shouldn't pretend to know what somebody's deepest motivation for something is like. We can make external judgments, meaning if you do this thing, we have to put you in jail because we don't want to be putting ourselves at risk of you doing it again. But we can't make an internal judgment saying, we know you did that because you're evil and you love being evil. You don't know. So you're not, well, actually next week, our show is about that very thing. But only God knows what's really in somebody's heart and mind. We don't even always know ourselves why we really do things. So you don't even need to do that to yourself. You just gotta try to do your best. And when it's practical, set boundaries. We got to have laws in society, but whenever you can, put a good interpretation and know that you don't truly know what's deepest down for somebody.
Yeah, no. And I work with a lot of people on guilt. So that's my first question to them. Well, what was your intention? And then I go, well, I didn't mean it. I said, well, there you go. If your intention was good, that's all that matters, right? Yep. What do you think Swedenborg would say about being mindful and paying attention and being aware of the things around you and living in the moment? For me, that's a really big deal. For me, that's what makes me see the spirituality in a flower. That's what makes me feel closer to God and have that alignment. So is there anything in his writings that refers to, staying here and noticing or being mindful?
Yeah, I think it would be very hard to pick something that he doesn't touch on in his writings. Because we've been doing shows for like 2 years, and we're not like, I don't see the finish line, because he wrote so much and covers such a broad range. He says a lot about what you're talking about. There's a quote coming to mind for me that worrying about the future greatly impedes the inflow of spiritual life.
Yes.
That's because there's a state that he talks about getting into, which he calls being in the stream of providence. You remember how I talked about divine providence before? This is the governance of the greater mind over all of us, and that things are going to work out well. If you can get into a point where you believe that as actually the truth, and that's, and what you're thinking is, even though I know bad things can happen, in the end, good is going to be brought out of it. It's going to be a happy ending to everything. The more you get into that state, the more you can relax and be in the present, because you're not, you got to take certain steps to, like, if it's freezing out, you close the door, right? You can't just say, God's going to take care of it.
Right. People give you that. People really assume that you go into this strange place and do that, though. I don't know why, but it's true. I
mean, he's saying that the funny thing is, and I keep jumping topics, but the funny thing is, I talked before about God is with you in that partnership. It's in you acting on what seems to be your own, that partnership really is. So that is God's closing the door there with you, but you gotta put in some effort, So the more you can trust divine providence, the more that then you're in this present, and that allows goodness and truth to flow into you, because you have this sense of humility, or what he would call innocence, about the moment, and he says, he talks about angels. I talked about angels being people who have evolved. That mindset is while it can very well recall the past and can have great insight into the future, it's very much not interested in those things as opposed to the present. That you have, the angels are less and less bogged down by the past and less concerned about the future. They're sort of having their full awareness in the moment. And what exactly that feels like, I think it's a universal truth that the less you're thinking about the past and future, the happier you are. I mean, I don't got to tell you that. Swedenborg doesn't got to tell you that, but he will give you, like I said, here's the metaphysical or spiritual reasons why that is. But certainly there's something to be said for relax. And it's not just, I find when I'm focusing on the present, it's not just that I'm here in time, but it's also that you kind of drop your assumptions that you walk around with. Yeah. And that the more we are loose about that, the more that we can get insight, because he says that it is wisdom to acknowledge that what you know is next to nothing compared to what you don't know.
Right. Oh gosh, Dave and I talk about that all the time. Being comfortable with the uncomfortable, being comfortable not knowing, and really embracing that. That's the coolest ever.
Yeah, that he says, right. That he says that even angels who have just this amazing amount of wisdom and insight know that compared to what there is to know, I'm a new beginner. And that's true about this situation, even physically. What are we going to know about the world 200 years from now that I have no idea is going on in this room right now? And I really don't understand anything about how this technology is working to make this happen right here. I don't even, I don't even know, like, how's my food digesting right now? There's so many things I don't know. There's so many things I don't know about myself, about the people around me. So it's not, I do know enough to drive a car and get home, and you gotta do that. But keeping this part of the mind that is saying, I want to be open to learning. I feel like that's part of being in the present. That being in the present sort of forces you to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it makes you more gentle and more open to other ideas and other perspectives. And I think that for me, that's a really big part of what we're talking about. Yeah. So Dave, he's talking exactly what we talk about all the time. Right?
I know.
Except that Swedenborg went to, he did all the hard work. We're just kind of living it.
I went and listened to your show and just wrote notes on what you wanted to hear. And so now I'm reading.
Oh my God. It's great. That's great.
It just fascinates me. Someone 300 years ago had a message that we're just catching on to now, because we're getting outside of doctrine that so much of us have grown up with. I mean, something as basic as, I've got to do good, because if I don't, I'm going to be punished and go to hell. You know,
Right.
that thing that so many of us, regardless of the faith that we're at, think as the concept. And then we suddenly start to ask, well, if I have free will and I have choice, and now we listen to an experiencer like David Bennett who says, well, wait a minute, the judgment at death isn't God looking at you and then proclaiming a direction. It's you evaluating your own journey and you making a decision as to whether that was good or not. And then if you choose to continue to do more good, well, there's a place in the spiritual world that you can go. And if you like to hang around with people who like to do evil things, then we'll put you over in a different community here in the spiritual world. You're not going to be burning alive in fire and brimstone.
That's right. And he gives sort of updated definitions for everything. He talks about, you hear about hellfire, right? Hellfire is this scary thing. Hatred is hellfire. He talks about that is the burning that causes all this misery. When you have within your intent, I want to harm this person, that's hellfire. And that actually does more damage to the world than any literal fire does. Mm-hmm. And nobody, God is not interested in revenge by pain. He's not interested in you transgressed this many times. So to make it right, I'm going to make you feel pain for that. The only things that are ever allowed to happen to anyone that are painful are for their own good eventually. Like we can even look back and see, oh, this thing, I didn't like it at the time, but man, I'm a better person because of it. Like that, infinite love and wisdom is not gonna get revenge on people. Think about a person. Think about the most wise and loving person that you know. I mean, just imagine them in your mind. You know that the more loving and wise they are, the less they're going to be petty and the less they're going to want to punish and get revenge. And just imagine that amped up to infinity. There's no way, it's laughable to think that a God would act in such a punitive manner,
Right.
Especially the God that created the conditions in which we all came to life in the first place. So yeah, I do think that Swedenborg, there was ideas like that Swedenborg really felt like that's part of why he was so focused on Christianity, because it was putting out those ideas at his time and putting that in a way
Right.
that you weren't really allowed to stand up to it. And he was saying, this is destroying people's spiritual lives. And he was really worried about the people teaching that kind of stuff, because he's
Right.
like, do not convince yourself of those ideas. Don't use religion as a tool to gain power. That is really bad for your spirit. Well, that's very hard for you to let go of. If you start to use this thing that is meant to uplift people in the deepest, most beautiful way, and you're using it to get rich and powerful, and in the meantime causing all this psychological harm through fear and that kind of thing, don't touch that. That's a really bad life investment to be doing that. And he was trying to wake people up to that.
Mm. Since he's talked about everything, has he also touched on the sort of the collective energy and how energy, loving energy is transmitted, is contagious, and how it and so is negative energy. So just from a spiritual perspective, how loving wisdom or loving kindness, or however you want to put that, is spread.
Yeah. So he doesn't use the term energy. I don't think it was used in the same way then, but he does talk about, I think he would probably use in place of that affection or something like that. He talks about communities, spiritual communities, where you can actually literally share affection. Like if I'm feeling a certain way, I can transfer that feeling to you. He says,
Right.
He doesn't describe the process. He just says, in a wonderful way, they can transfer this. But he also talks about communal knowledge, and that when you come in, so this is the wisdom side, when you come into a particular spiritual community, if you're a fit for it, you suddenly know everything that they know. And you feel like, I've always known this, because it hits you at such a deep level. So he talks about so sharing on that way, but he also talks about the entirety of heaven. He says, the whole of heaven communicates with each individual, and each individual communicates with the whole of heaven. Heaven being this collection of everybody who's ever wanted to be, like everyone who's buying into the, hey, let's get along philosophy,
Right.
So somehow there's a sharing of there's a connection of every person with everyone else and everyone else with every person, whatever that connection is. So he describes these sort of specifics and then these generalities, but it's more communal there than it's here.
Yeah.
You're still autonomous. You still have a sense of being who you are.
Okay.
You still know you're a person, you know, like I'm me, but it's funny actually in this show that we're doing right now, we talk about the dual nature of autonomy and intimacy, and how that these things are what is sort of the struggle in every relationship here, that you want to be really close to people, but you want to still have boundaries, you know, and that if either of those get compromised, you're in trouble. You know, if you don't have anybody that you're connected with, you're in trouble, or if you have people that are overstepping your boundaries, you're in trouble. He says that there's like a spiritual, that dynamic, getting the sweet spot in that dynamic continues in the afterlife, that people grow closer to God and closer forever, but you always know that I'm me and you're God. You know, you can have like moments of feeling, but it's not like you ever disappear, you know, that, and even though angels like would just love to just like, hey, God, you're so cool. I just want you to be everything. But God is like, I want you to feel like, I want you to be you, because this is the way you can experience the greatest happiness, is a partnership between two, rather than, you know, so the more, and so on a wider level in heaven, there is like this community that's tighter and more loving than you can possibly believe, but yet people are contributing in their own individual way, in a way that nobody else can. He likens it to the human body, and just like you look at the human body and everything, it's not just a mush of love, you know, like we're talking about love and wisdom. There's so much order in that thing. There is like every little cell is in its right place, and every part of every cell, you know, like you have the lipids in the cell wall, and the hydrophilic part is on one side, the hydrophobic part is on the other. Because if you don't have that structure, the whole body suffers. And he said, that's the autonomy, intimacy. Everything is completely interdependent. You know, everything is working together. And like you think about the liver is giving everything it has to the body. It's working completely for the body, and it's receiving everything it needs, blood, you know, the oxygen in blood, everything that it needs from the body. But yet it's got a membrane around it. It is its own thing. It's different than the kidneys, which are next to it. But because that's the way that actually you can get the closest, is if there's this like, we're different things working together. There's something of the essence of heaven in that.
You know, and this is the last thing I'll talk about, because boy, we're going on and on and on. That when you just brought something up so powerful to me, Curtis, and I never thought of it this way, but when I had a glimpse with my father as he was dying, and there was the sense of me losing track of the two of us. And becoming, I felt like I did disappear into space, and then I saw that we were the same. But when you were talking about that, for the very first time in my life, I saw it as focusing your eye. When your eye, it went out of focus, so it kind of meshed together, and then it came back into focus, and we got separated again. And all of a sudden, the revelation was there for me, like, oh my gosh, you know, we are individuals, but yeah, we're the same. We're one. And so that was the very first time that the visual, you know, that came to my mind, thinking of going out of focus and coming back in focus. So you don't ever stay. Now I know that there's this other place, even though we're individuals, if that makes any sense.
It totally makes sense. It's kind of like closing your eyes, you know, to use eye metaphors. You can close them sometimes and you get a different experience, you know, if you're around somebody or like, you know, feeling a breeze or something, but you can also open them again, you know, and I think there are probably periods like you're describing. Well, I mean, you've already experienced it, where you probably have in the spiritual world, like these experiences where you do feel like I'm one with everything. He talks about angels who, get so filled up with God that they think they are. They don't know the difference anymore, and they're just like. But that's not the permanent state. You know, they're just like here in life. There's continual variation. You know, we talk basic things, day and night, seasons, states of mind. Everything is constantly changing, and it's the same there. Or else, you know, things will become stagnant. And so I bet that there are these cool transitions between. It's sort of like when you're watching a movie and you get so engrossed in the movie, and then you're like, oh, right, it's Sunday at whatever time, and the week is starting up. I bet you get like, oh, we're all one. He's like, oh no, I am me, but you come out of it more excited about the whole and how you can contribute to it. You know.
That's exactly right. Interesting. Huh, Dave?
It's a philosophy that, like philosophy supposed to do, make you think and start to connect the dots together. Because certainly, as you're talking about examples, I'm thinking of being in the hospital in crisis mode, calling for help. I need help. And do I have a God? Is anyone listening to me? Do I have my angelic forces around me to guide and direct me? And why is this happening? And am I being punished? And all those things that you're talking about in real life today have answers when you look at the model as you talk about it, in terms of the free choices that you have, and that there's a reason for what's happening. And if you watch, if you could wait and be more patient, you'll eventually figure out what the pattern that you're in is all about. And that journey can be very calming and allow you to deal with all the storms of life once you're not fighting it. Once you're just saying, I'm in the moment, I'm dealing with this, I am protected, my connection to the spiritual world is there, and there's guidance that I can draw upon. Did Swedenborg give any indication of what's the best way to get help when you're fighting the realities of your life today?
Yeah, one thing that he doesn't do very often is give you simple how-tos, and often when we get to one of those in my programming, it's because we've synthesized it from a lot of stuff that he's said. Like this is probably what you do. He does say that what you're describing there is exactly, he talks about spiritual trials is one way, or shattering experiences, he calls, is another way it's been translated, where the things, like what you were going through there is you had a physical thing happening in your life that really shook you up spiritually, that I'm wondering what's real and what's not real, what's my position in reality, am I alone or am I cared for, and thinking about the big things of life rather than what we go around usually thinking about. And that was a spiritual and a physical experience for you. And so he talks about that in those moments, God is closer than ever. That's actually, when we're in these times of trial or crisis, that's actually the closest we get, even closer then. And even though you feel like more alone, but because there's something happening there that's going to have lasting impact, and that's going to bring something good out of it. As far as like, how do you get a sense of not being alone? To me, Swedenborg talks about angels being able to flow into, he talks a lot about it flowing in, like being able to flow into what we know. We talked about Swedenborg needing to have this foundation in order to be able to receive the information that he did. If we have the right concepts in our mind, we can kind of be comforted by them, and that comfort is heaven coming in. So I like to try to bring to mind ideas, or what I would call truths, that are comforting, and even sometimes reading them, like, oh yeah, providence is taking care of everything. And even though I already had that in my memory bank, to bring it back out, it suddenly comes alive. And suddenly I get a feeling along with it. And when the feeling starts to come, the mood can change, and my whole perception of the experience can change. Different people have different things. People have specific prayers that they feel like they'll have a particular piece of some kind. If they repeat it, I think you find your own. What I've had a lot of success with is having little snippets of truth, and having like 5 or 6 of those or something, and just repeating those sort of in response to negative things that come up. And you kind of, I would say, make your own based on what you really feel like is true, but then have those and return to the truths rather than trying to think your way around it. And like, what do I do? And spin wheels. You just repeat those things and say, okay, providence is taking care of everything, or whatever is powerful to you. I had my grandfather, who I didn't get to meet because he died before I was born, but as he was getting close to dying, he couldn't speak, but he could write still. And people were saying, what's going to happen? What do you think you're going to go? Or I don't know exactly what they were asking him, but he wrote, I hope that the Lord or God will use me as his best for everyone. As I hope that whatever happens to me. And so I'll say that sometimes, like if I'm getting some kind of worry about how's this going to turn out for me, is this going to be, if I say I hope the Lord will use me as His best for everyone, just changes the mental climate to where certain fears and agitations can't survive that. It's like in a petri dish, you put something in there, all the bacteria die. That's like you're putting something in the mind there that it doesn't, you got to work at developing a good system because sometimes things are persistent. But I do find that just reminding yourself of things you already acknowledge, but in the moment having some shorthand way to remind yourself, that can be pretty powerful.
Well, he certainly learned an awful lot, and all those principles that he had, he must have applied to himself in some way when his life became really unbearable, being branded as a heretic, and his downward spiral from the acceptance of his peers to being ostracized. He was now in crisis mode. Did he ever write about his life as he was living it and what he had learned on his travels to how to deal with what was now happening to him?
Sure. And really, I think his biggest crisis was actually what I was talking about earlier, when he was writing his dreams down and like the precursor to his spiritual experience. He was really, everything was being shaken for him then. And that he writes intensely about how that changed him. And then he would not only have in life going forward from that, he wasn't just having people bothering him, but he was having spirits and stuff go after him now, because now he was on the radar. So he wrote this book called Heaven and Hell, because it wasn't all just nice people there. He was getting all kinds of attacks, but he had at some point in there come to this point where even the bad things that were happening, he had this, through his writing, you could see he had this calm about it because he knew something good is coming out of this. So I was shown this, but he didn't start there. He started just like any of us did, but initially, in his Journal of Dreams talks about just a lot of intense stuff about just shaking on the bed and just I don't know what to do and that kind of stuff. But him slowly being strengthened, and once he got to his publishing phase, he wasn't writing that journal anymore. He did have what's called now Journal of Spiritual Experiences, or Spiritual Diary. It's sometimes translated, where he just day to day talked about what happened to him. But he doesn't go as deeply into the events of his life. He's always talking about the spiritual side of things. Yeah. He has some letters that you get to, but even then he's talking to. It's not like Dear Diary stuff. I don't know what his emotional range was like then, but he certainly had a lot of cool things, but a lot of really tough things happened then. But I think by that time he had seen such a clear vision of what kind of love and wisdom God has and what heaven is like. It's almost like whatever's going on earth is just a puddle, right, compared to the ocean that's going. And for him, it was so viscerally real that, put me on trial, go after me. The thing he cared about was his ideas getting out. But as far as his personal safety, I think he understood just how good the safety net is under all of us. In such a real way that I bet that I'm sure he had ups and downs, but probably not as much as he should have because of what he went through. Because, as you said, these experiences were applied to his own life.
Boy, and I could really appreciate, based on what we've talked about in the past, Dave, is how I talk about, when something tough comes up, to get closer to it. Don't push it away. Don't run away from it. And I love when Curtis said, it's those times when you're closest to God. And that makes so much sense to me. I never thought of it that way, but that's exactly it. And that's why you want to lean in. That's why you want to get closer. As much as it seems crazy to do so, that to me can be very helpful to me and in helping clients to understand why it's so critical, if you do have a faith, to lean into those tough times, because that's where the action is. That's where it all happens.
Swedenborg even says that nobody grows spiritually except through difficulties. That's like we're doing it's not like you can make spiritual progress by learning and doing good things, but there's a essential nutrient that you get through going through these tough times that you gotta, it's, like a one your body, there's nutrients physically your body can't manufacture. You gotta get them out of food. It's sort of like you can't grow spiritually without having some of these struggles. So I think that changes the perspective, because when bad things happen, and it's not like I walk around like unfazed by anything. I'm not where Swedenborg was. I'm just a regular person. But when you get, if you can get that mindset of like, because when you get into hard things happening, you kind of think, I wish this wasn't happening.
Right.
But if you have some sort of sense of like, okay, well, we got to get through this one, then it can change. It can actually reduce the suffering within the suffering.
Of course it does. Yes.
You can go through these same things, but without the unnecessary suffering that comes from not having this confidence in the greater process.
Well, there you go, audience. We've got a snippet. I mean, a small snippet of what Curtis talks about every Monday night. And, there are just so many questions, that I know most of us ask one another about, are there evil spirits? Do we deal with the afterlife in a reality way? Why do we come here if heaven is a great place to be? I mean, there's so many things that we want to talk about of, what's happening in our lives today from what we are taught in our religious doctrines of good and evil and second comings and Armageddon and all kinds of things that, we're all wrestling with as we grow. And Swedenborg had a perspective because he visited a tangible world for decades and documented it. And it's an unbelievable big. It's going to be the best series of movies. Talk about Star Wars. I mean, you could just have Swedenborg trilogy. I mean, you've got just so many stories, so many things that he saw, and it asks and answers so many of the questions that you face every day. Now, you can challenge it all like we do everything else and say the guy was a lunatic. He was hallucinating. I mean, what was he? But when you look at it, you start to say, no, that's not really something you're going to come away with. You're going to say this was real. This was something that you've got to pay attention to.
Yeah, and I would say look at the concepts. Don't even worry about okay, Swedenborg was a guy, but look at what he wrote and look at your life, because I haven't had like an overt spiritual experience, like a near-death experience or something like that. Yet I am finding evidence for Swedenborg's material in my own thought and feeling patterns, in the way that life is. Like we're talking about the way that the flower feels when you see it. You can like study in your own life. Is this showing up or not? So you don't even have to take it all on credit, which is I think what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah.
So how are people going to follow you? What's the best way that people can pay attention to the message that you bring out on Mondays?
Sure. I'd say you could go to Swedenborg.com. That's the Swedenborg Foundation's website. There's links to everything on there. That's probably the easiest. If you want to follow specifically what I'm doing, we're on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is called Off the Left Eye, which is a reference to an experience Swedenborg had where he was given the use of spiritual sight, and it seemed like a covering was rolled off of his left eye, which we could talk about another day. But youtube.com/off the left eye. Or if you just search Swedenborg on YouTube, we're going to come up, because believe it or not, there's not very many people making Swedenborg videos on YouTube. So,
and don't forget your Facebook page. I mean, you've got lots of things there.
We have a Facebook page called Heaven and Hell, which is the title of his most popular book. If you go to Swedenborg.com, you kind of get the links to all that stuff. But search Swedenborg anywhere, you'll bump into us eventually, because as I said, nobody knows who he is, so nobody else is making stuff.
Well, Sheila, what do you think about today?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm excited because, as you know, I'm not really in my previous life, prior to things that have happened to me that were rough and wonderful. I was very knowledge-based and scientific, and I've sort of gotten rid of that part of my life. I'm not interested in adding any more knowledge. But the thing that's so fascinating to me here is the connections that I'm already feeling with my basic experiences and things that are sort of, I call intuition, but as we're all, connected, as he's saying, I feel like I'm curious. So I'm going to be looking into it to find, if nothing else, just to find more connections for me and see where it takes me. I'm excited. Thank you so much, Curtis, for joining us.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
On December the 8th, we're going to have another visit with Curtis and David Bennett. He's going to come on board. We've got an experiencer and a media producer who understands some Swedenborg journeys and try to talk about what actually happens in this spiritual world. So invite everyone to come back then. But Curtis, thank you ever so much for being here today. This was just a wonderful opening to many people to get an idea of who Swedenborg was and why he's someone we should give some time to learn from.
Thanks so much for having me. That was fun.
Well, don't go away. You stay here with us. We're going to stop the recording now. Let our audience take a break because they're probably run out of ink in their pens, taking notes down from what we've been talking about. But thanks all for watching us. Come back next week, findyournewnormal.com/live, and you'll see our next show, which is a review show. Sheila and I are going to take a look at the last 3 shows we've done and sort of summarize what the content was. So bring your questions, come into our Q&A session, and let's discuss what our guests have shared with us to get some takeaways that can help us deal with living in the moment and handling those moments of crisis that we often face in life. So come back next week, every Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern at findyournewnormal.com/live. Thanks very much, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.